Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime.
It's Canada Day 1992. A celebration is planned in a small fishing village just outside of St. John's, Newfoundland. But nobody is in the mood to celebrate. Local fishermen are angry about plans to shut down their industry, ending a 400-year tradition and way of life. So when the federal politician responsible for the closure turns up for the festivities, they heckle him loudly. As he makes his way through the irate crowd, the cabinet minister snaps, and he says, "I didn't take the fish from the goddamn water, so don't go abusing me." I'm Kathy Kinzora, and this is History of the 90s, a podcast about a decade that changed the world. In this episode, we're looking back at an event that led to the largest industrial layoff in Canada, devastating Newfoundland's economy and shaking the province's identity to the core. This is the Cod Moratorium. When the Italian explorer John Cabot first crossed the Atlantic Ocean in 1497, he was dazzled by what he discovered. Off the eastern coast of what would become Newfoundland, just below the surface of the water, thousands of fish shined like crinkled foil. His crew later said there were so many codfish that they could catch them simply by lowering a basket into the water. John Cabot had set sail from Bristol, England, in search of a northern spice route at the request of King Henry VII. But that changed at the sight of all that cod.
There's a saying that cod is said to be the fish that launched 1,000 ships, and I think Atlantic cod certainly attracted seasonal European fishing fleets from England and Ireland and France, Spain, Portugal to the Grand Banks for, a good century or more.
That's Jenn Thornhill-Verma. She's an author and reporter who covers fisheries, oceans, and climate change. She says in the early 1600s, Europeans began establishing permanent settlements up and down the eastern and southern coasts of Newfoundland.
And I think what started as a migratory fishery as far back as the 15th century gave way to what would become more resident operations and people living there year-round. And it was particularly salt cod. I mean, that was the engine that drove the fishery in those early stages. And there was an inshore Newfoundland fishery, there was a northern fishery off Labrador, and then you had also the offshore Grand Banks fishery.
The offshore fishers would make several trips to the Grand Banks each season, staying out in their wooden schooners and sealing steamers for weeks at a time before returning home with a vessel full of cod. As for the inshore fishers, early each morning they left their homes in small open boats known as punts, skiffs, and dories, and rowed to nearby fishing grounds. It was tough work, as they mostly used long hand lines with a baited hook at one end that was dropped in the water and pulled in by hand once they had a bite. And the days were long, with fishers staying out until the evening when their boats were filled with cod. To prepare the catch for the European market, the codfish were split, salted, and dried in the sun for several days on flakes, which are raised wooden platforms laid out on the beaches up and down the eastern and southeastern coastline. At that time, the salt cod caught in the waters off Newfoundland accounted for half of the fish consumed in Europe. So it made for a steady living during the fishing season, which was supplemented by other jobs in the winter, such as fur trapping and timber cutting. Over time, the small villages expanded to include churches, schools, and medical clinics. Life carried on like this with very little change for more than 2 centuries. But following World War II, there was a vast shift, thanks to major advances in fishing technology. Better nets and the use of radios and sonar meant that the number of cod being caught grew substantially. There was also a shift away from traditional saltfish to a fresh and frozen fishery, which used draggers and trawlers. Jenn Thornhill-Verma says that's when things started becoming quite industrialized.
So draggers were, as the name implies, they drag nets along the ocean floor, and they are, an efficient means for catching cod. And they carry ice, they can make shorter trips to and from port, they can bring fresh fish to market. So it also, that brought about a lot of change on the shorelines too, because it centralized the processing plants and it supported this frozen fish market versus the salt fish.
By 1953, there were more than 500 of these massive trawlers fishing the Northwest Atlantic. As a result, many of the schooners that started the salt cod fishery were forced out of the industry because they simply couldn't compete with what was essentially a floating fish factory. And it meant that cod and other types of fish were being caught at rates never seen before. By the 1960s, the number of trawlers grew to 1,000, and catch rates soared to approximately 800,000 tons of codfish each year. In the previous 2 centuries, only 250,000 tons of cod were being caught each year. Put another way, the amount of cod caught in 15 years between 1960 and 1975 was roughly equal to what the entire catch had been in 250 years between 1500 and 1750. The numbers were staggering, and not many knew it at the time, but it was the beginning of the end for the North Atlantic cod fishery. An early sign of trouble appeared in the 1970s. For the first time, catch numbers began to decline. And much of the blame was placed on foreign factory vessels from countries such as the Soviet Union, Spain, Portugal, and Japan, who were responsible for approximately 80% of the catch in the Grand Banks. So in 1977, Canada took steps to protect fish stocks by introducing a new 200-mile limit, meaning no foreign ships could fish within 200 miles of the country's coastline. That was a major change because previously the limit had been just 12 miles. Catch quotas had also been set, which were supposed to equal the amount of fish that could be taken from the ocean without depleting the stock. However, it didn't come to light until the 1980s that scientists had made a mistake. They had overestimated the abundance of cod as well as their growth rate, which meant quotas had been set way too high. Cod stocks were nowhere near as large as previously thought. The Canadian government gradually cut quotas and fish companies responded with layoffs. But foreign ships continued to heavily fish outside the 200-mile limit, maintaining there was no problem with the cod. Then, in June 1992, a report by scientists revealed the situation had become dire. Cod stocks were at or near the lowest level ever recorded. The report recommended the government drastically slash the catch quota to 50,000 tons, which would essentially amount to a shutdown of the cod fishery for the rest of that year. And that would spell disaster for up to 30,000 small boat fishermen and plant workers in a province that already had Canada's highest unemployment rate. But really, there was no choice about what to do next, even if it had the potential to destroy a centuries-old way of life. On June 30th, 1992, CBC News reported that the federal government was about to announce a moratorium on the northern cod fishery. It said the ban on cod fishing along Newfoundland's east coast would last 18 months to allow time for the stocks to replenish. The unconfirmed report said that Ottawa would provide up to $500 million in aid for laid-off workers. The next day, which was Canada Day, the federal fisheries minister traveled to the small Newfoundland community of Bay Bulls, which is about 30 kilometers south of St. John's, the province's capital city. John Crosbie was a long-time, often controversial politician who also happened to be a born and bred Newfoundlander. When he arrived at the festivities, he was confronted by an angry mob who had heard CBC's report about a potential moratorium. More than 350 disgruntled fishers and plant workers, along with other irate men, women, and children, surrounded Crosbie and demanded more details. But he refused to provide any, saying an official announcement would come the next day. When the crowd continued jeering, Crosbie stopped and said, "Why are you yelling at me? I didn't take the fish from the goddamn water, so stop abusing me." A woman yelled back, "This situation is not our fault." Crosbie responded, "It's not my fault either, and I'm trying to do the best I can." The anger continued the next day at a news conference being held at the St. John's Radisson Plaza Hotel. Inside a conference room, John Crosbie confirmed the worst. Effective that night at midnight, the cod fishery would be shut down for at least 2 years, until the spring of 1994.
But fishermen didn't take the news well. About 200 angry fishermen tried to break into the room where Crosbie was answering reporters' questions.
Bill, call the police for a backup, quick!
Inside the hotel conference room, as fishermen banged on the door, Crosbie explained the causes of the cod collapse.
The northern cod stock has fallen to historic lows as a result of three main problems. First, overestimation of the stock by Canada, leading to the setting of total allowable catches that we now know were too high. Secondly, foreign overfishing of northern cod outside 200 miles, which, as an example, amounted to more than 48,000 tons last year. And third, devastating ecological factors.
Overnight, more than 30,000 fishers and plant workers lost their jobs in what is considered by many to be the largest mass layoff in Canadian history. Labour leader Buzz Hargrove called it a catastrophe not witnessed before in the 20th century. He said, quote, "This is the shutdown of the very heart and soul of this province, of a way of life for generations." Even though many knew it was coming, the news was still devastating.
Talking to fishermen, many would say yes, they saw the writing on the wall, because you also saw families already moving from fishing ground fish like cod in Capeland to, moving to the near and offshore fishery fishing shellfish. I do think that there were a segment of the population who understood that as a fisherman, you have to be diversified. So a bad year on cod might mean, a good year on Capeland, and that also people stuck to their knitting. They did what they always did. They prepped their gear, and when season opened, they got out there and they made the best of it. So I do think for some people, it felt like their world changed overnight. And for others, I think that there was an appreciation that this was probably a long time coming.
At the moratorium announcement, Fisheries Minister John Crosbie said the government would provide laid-off workers emergency payments of up to $225 a week for the next 10 weeks. That was later adjusted to a maximum of $400 and extended until the end of 1992 for a total of nearly 5 months of emergency relief. After that, the government set up various relief programs that offered workers temporary financial assistance if they participated in retraining programs to prepare them for jobs outside the fishery. It would seem that even then, the government and others knew that northern cod levels would never return to what they once were. And at the end of the 2-year shutdown, the moratorium was extended indefinitely. It was the end of an era. Meantime, a new fisheries minister appointed by Ottawa in 1993 shifted his focus to another fish species that was also in trouble. Turbot are a large flatfish that live in the North Atlantic, clinging to the slopes hundreds of meters below the continental shelf where the northern cod once ruled. The fish, which are also called Greenland halibut, don't have the texture or flavor of cod. Even still, turbot were seen as a bright spot that could assist in economic recovery for those who had lost their livelihood when the cod fishery closed down. But there was a growing concern that European factory trawlers were overfishing turbot on the Grand Banks just outside the 200-mile limit. Between 1990 and 1994, Spanish and Portuguese trawlers tripled their catches of turbot, from 27,000 tons to 63,000. Plus, Canada recorded numerous violations by the foreign fleet, including fishing inside the 200-mile limit, as well as using illegal fishing gear to harvest the stock. With Newfoundland still reeling from the economic devastation of the cod moratorium, the federal fisheries minister decided to go to war over the turbot. 40-year-old Brian Tobin, a born and bred Newfoundlander and first-time cabinet minister, convinced Prime Minister Jean Chrétien to take steps to protect the fish. In March 1995, Canada unilaterally took steps to make it illegal for Spain and Portugal to fish for turbot on the nose and tail of the Grand Banks. And to back it up, 5 Canadian fisheries vessels, along with a Canadian Forces destroyer, were sent out to patrol the area. Within days, a Spanish trawler using an illegal trawl net was spotted fishing for turbot. 3 Canadian ships surrounded the Esti, and a team of RCMP and fisheries officers attempted to board the Spanish vessel. And as they did, the Esti crew threw the Canadian ladders overboard and cut their own fishing net, sending it plunging to the bottom of the ocean. The Esti then made a run for it. For several hours, 3 Canadian ships chased the fishing vessel, while an armada of 8 other Spanish ships kept pace with the chase in an effort to protect the Esti. Finally, the captain of the Canadian vessel, the Cape Roger, fired 4 warning shots from a .50 caliber machine gun, which ended the pursuit. The 30-member crew of the Esti was ordered below deck, and fisheries and RCMP officers boarded the ship and arrested its master. In Madrid, the Spanish government condemned what it called the persecution and harassment of one of its fishing vessels, and it accused Canada of committing a flagrant violation of international law. Spain asked the International Court of Justice in The Hague to rule on whether Canada had overstepped its jurisdiction. But Brian Tobin maintained Canada was justified in its actions.
The Spanish fleet is continuing to fish out of control, threatening to destroy what little remains of straddling stocks off Canada's Atlantic coast. It was only when all else failed that Canada took measures unilaterally to end overfishing. We did so to ensure the survival of threatened straddling stocks. We did so out of necessity.
As the legal battle played out in The Hague, Tobin had the Department of Fisheries and Oceans contract a vessel to retrieve the trawl net that the crew of the Esti had cut loose. It ended up being an illegal net with a liner and small mesh that essentially acts like a bulldozer on the ocean floor, destroying marine habitats by scooping up everything in its path. In particular, baby turbot were being caught up in the illegal net. It was the final straw for Tobin. On March 29, 1995, the fisheries minister scheduled a news conference in New York City.
The Canada-Spain fish war moved from the high seas to the much calmer waters of New York City's East River today. Fisheries Minister Brian Tobin chartered a boat to ferry reporters out to a barge where he displayed what he says is the giant net from the Spanish trawler Esti, arrested by Canada 2 weeks ago.
With cameras rolling, Canadian fisheries officers measured the net's mesh, which Tobin claimed was undersized and was contributing to the possible extinction of turbot on the Grand Banks. The net hanging from a crane on a barge in the East River directly across from the United Nations headquarters is an image that is still unforgettable to Newfoundlanders and Labradorians who navigated through this troubled time in their fishery. Tobin, who was no stranger of political theater, made an impassioned plea on behalf of the endangered fish.
We're down now finally to one last, lonely, unloved, unattractive little turbot, clinging on by its fingernails to the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, saying, "Someone reach out and save me in this 11th hour as I'm about to go down to extinction."
For this effort, Tobin earned a political nickname, the Turbinator, and he drew international attention to the escalating turbot war. In retaliation, Spain implemented visa requirements for Canadians visiting the country and deported Canadian expats living in Spain. And the Spanish Navy deployed 2 armed patrol ships to protect Spanish trawlers that continued to fish for turbot off the Grand Banks. Tensions continued growing when the Canadian government authorized the Navy to take any action necessary to protect the fish stocks. It seemed like a violent high seas confrontation was inevitable. And then on April 15, 1995, the European Union approved a peace deal put forward by Canada. It included tougher enforcement and conservation measures, including independent onboard inspectors and increased satellite surveillance of EU fishing vessels. And it set catch quotas at 10,000 tons each for Canada and the EU. Meantime, as the cod moratorium continued, unemployment rates in Newfoundland reached a high of 20%. To make matters worse, the biggest retraining program, called the Atlantic Groundfish Strategy, known as TAGS, ran out of funding in 1997, a year earlier than anticipated. That's because Ottawa expected approximately 26,000 fishers and plant workers to sign up for the program. They were totally caught off guard when 40,000 people applied. Later, Canada's Auditor General released a scathing report saying TAGS failed to help people get out of the fishing industry and only succeeded in creating a dependence on government assistance. Money earmarked for training was instead used for income support payments because of the overwhelming number of applicants and their dire financial situations. As a result of the moratorium, unemployment rates in Newfoundland reached a high of 20%. And Jenn Thornhill-Verma says many people began to leave the province, heading for places like Ontario and the Alberta oil sands in search of work.
Because you had these communities that were just, and still today, I mean, there are communities wholly reliant on wild fisheries. In that case, we saw this outward migration of people like the province had never seen before. And so from 1992 to I think it was 2007, 2008, you had the population to climb over to 70,000. So for like a population of 500,000 people, that's significant.
Jenn says the moratorium shook the entire foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador and led to the near extinction of its outports. Fishing sheds were boarded up, wooden dories were left to rot on beaches, and entire communities were vacated.
For me, I think one of the biggest impacts when I look at a community like where my father grew up in Little Bay East on Fortune Bay, I have more people related to me buried 6 feet under than in that community anymore. We sold our grandfather's house for $14,000. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to buy a parking spot in Ontario for that price point.
Those that remained in Newfoundland pivoted to new ventures. Some began working in the offshore oil and gas industry, while others picked up tourism-related jobs. And as Jenn mentioned earlier, some turned to harvesting snow crab and lobster. In fact, today, crab is the anchor of Newfoundland and Labrador's fishing industry. However, in the early 2000s came warnings that snow crab stocks were also showing signs of decline. And then in 2017, scientists confirmed that the snow crab population had declined by more than 80% in less than 4 years.
I think the biggest factor that is not being talked about enough is the implications of climate change. So, lobster reigns supreme, snow crab, shrimp, these are all, people consider them the trifecta of fisheries in Atlantic Canada and wild fisheries in Canada. They bring in the bulk majority of Canadian wild fisheries earnings. But if you look at some of the latest science on how environmental factors and warming waters and other issues related to climate change are affecting cold water species, well, cold water species are moving to colder water, so they're moving further north. And interestingly, most fisheries management plans in Canada still don't consider those environmental factors.
Then in 2023, some encouraging news from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Scientists at the DFO had begun using a new type of modeling, and it showed that the cod stock was out of the critical zone for the first time in decades. But they emphasized the designation change was due to the use of different models, not because there was necessarily more fish in the water.
They realized, this population is not in the critical zone, which is where you absolutely don't want to be, and it's the worst case scenario for any fish population that you're trying to harvest. And they realized it was actually in the cautious zone. So it's not quite healthy, which is where you'd love it to be, but it's also not, on the brink. And, I think it's important to say that it's not like the number of cod in the water changed. The goalposts changed. How scientists assessed how much cod was in the water, that's what changed.
Either way, the next year in June 2024, the federal government ended the cod moratorium after more than 3 decades.
The moratorium will be lifted in areas where the cod were historically plentiful, off Labrador, to the north of Newfoundland, and to the east and the Grand Banks. The allowable catch this year will be 18,000 tons of cod, a far cry from 250,000 tons in the 1980s.
In a statement, the fisheries minister said ending the northern cod moratorium is a historic milestone for Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. And she added, "We will cautiously but optimistically build back this fishery." But critics pointed out that cod stocks are still very low, showing no sign of growth since 2016. They warned reopening the commercial fishery was a risky move. Some even accused the federal Liberal government of playing politics, suggesting they lifted the moratorium too soon in an effort to bolster its popularity in the province leading up to an election. And to back up those claims, several months after the government announcement, it was revealed that the fisheries minister had in fact been advised to maintain the moratorium by DFO scientists. But her political advisors argued that reopening the commercial fishery and hiking quotas would be a political victory. Following the 2025 federal election, Diane LeBouthillier was dropped as fisheries minister and replaced by Joanne Thompson. Several months later, Thompson boosted the northern cod quota again, setting the total allowable catch in 2025 at 38,000 tons, double what it was the year before. 80% of the catch goes to inshore fleet, 10% to offshore, and the remaining 10% to Indigenous groups. In addition, there is a 2,000-ton allocation, which will go to countries who fish outside of Canada's 200-mile limit. Despite the return to cod, the fishing industry in Newfoundland remains a small part of the province's economy. Today, mining is Newfoundland's largest industry in terms of gross domestic product, to the tune of $6.9 billion, while fishing of cod and other species gets lumped together with other agriculture, forestry, and hunting as the 15th largest industry. Even still, cod will always have a deep cultural and historic importance among Newfoundlanders. And that's probably why when tourists visit the beautiful province, they want to pay homage to the once mighty fish in a popular ceremony. During a boozy ritual called a screechin', the come-from-aways eat a piece of bologna, also known as Newfoundland steak, kiss a cod, and then take a shot of screech rum to wash it down. During the ceremony, they also recite the age-old saying, "Long may your big jib draw." It's a wish for good luck. May the wind always be in your forward sails. Thank you for listening to this look back at what happened when the cod stock collapsed in Newfoundland. And thanks to my guest, Jenn Thornhill-Verma. In addition to reporting on fisheries, oceans, and climate change, she's also author of the book Cod Collapse: The Rise and Fall of Newfoundland's Saltwater Cowboys. I'll put info in the show notes in case you want to check it out. This episode was suggested to me by two of our listeners, John Baggs and Scott Wood, who are both proud Newfoundlanders. Thank you, John and Scott, for this great idea. If you have something you want covered on the show, send me an email at 90s@curiouscast.ca. That's 90s@curiouscast.ca. Or message me on Instagram at that90spodcast. This episode was hosted and written by me, Kathy Gonzora. Our senior producer is Dila Velasquez. And sound design and final production is by Rob Johnston. See you next time for more History of the 90s.